Hi, welcome to the lecture on science and technology in the history of modern Europe. Science and technology have often been described in terms of revolutions and progress as either external drivers of modernity, following the theory of technological determinism, or as products of political and cultural ideas associated with the Enlightenment, such as rationality and liberalism. However, technological change and scientific revolutions and inventions and innovations were neither primarily resources nor outcomes of other historical processes, but remained deeply embedded in social and cultural context of the formation of Europe as a cultural, political, and economic unit. The lecture is divided into three parts, based mainly on standard chronology of European history. The first focuses on the early modern period, a time of social transition from the traditional towards the modern. Scientific and technological change played a central, if often overlooked, part in this process, which is usually described in terms of the expansion of capitalism and the related development of institutions and innovation cultures. New inventions, but perhaps more importantly, new knowledge, cultures, were an achievement from which large parts of the enlightened 18th century elites derived their self-conception, embodying progress and modernity. The second part discusses the period between the French Revolution and the outbreak of the First World War, an era marked by the unforeseen dynamism of research and technology, by the formation of the independent academic disciplines that we know today, including biology, chemistry, history, philology, and so on, and also by a growing gap between the sciences and the humanities. It was also a period in which technology radically transformed the production of goods and came to shape the everyday lives of growing numbers of people in Europe and across the world, increasing human interconnectedness. Moreover, this period witnessed the professionalization of scientific pursuit and growing state intervention in science and technology. Furthermore, while science and technology were presented and understood as universal, they were shaped by existing relations of power, which were particularly pronounced in the era of the Great Divergence, the socio-economic shift in which the Western sphere emerged as the wealthiest civilization, eclipsing the rest of the world. European powers used technology and science to extend their domination around the globe, while non-Europeans creatively appropriated both science and technology in an effort to resist European and American imperialism. Third part deals with the most recent developments, the so-called short 20th century, bounded by the outbreak of the First World War and the end of the Cold War, which has been called the Age of Extremes. Certainly this period's significant acceleration of technological change would undoubtedly rank high among those extremes. Processes of development and the implementation of new technological innovations became more deeply institutionalized and systemic than ever before, with states playing an increasingly active role. Furthermore, the production of innovations was built upon a growing state involvement with scientific research, which correspondingly became more and more organized. Science and technology, now joined into an inseparable whole, reconfigured their European users who, for their part, started to consciously influence and shape the direction of scientific and technological change with a growing intensity, particularly once they became aware of substantial downsides to ever-growing living standards, chiefly environmental degradation, but also increased dependence on complex technological systems. Orality was still important in early modern Europe, and much technological knowledge relied on learning one's trade in practice. However, the writing became an increasingly important medium for transmitting messages. The use of writing led to the formation of institutions such as the archive and the library. Writing began to form part of social reality. Literate mentalities developed which allowed those who could read and write to form a different view of the world. Early oral practices were put into writing, and trust in the written word increased. In the process, written knowledge and applied knowledge became separated from one another. Schooling imbued knowledge which might be applied as technique, as technology. The development of technology deepened the complexity of society. This increased complexity, in turn, increased demand for schooling and so on. Especially in the towns, audience developed for the products of the movable type printing press, developed by Johannes Gutenberg around 1440. The introduction of the printing press was momentous. The printing press generated a written culture that over the early modern centuries saw the rise of forms of scholarship and science with which we are still familiar today. From the 15th century, individual scholars housed their libraries and studies at their private homes. Small laboratories came into existence for alchemy and medicine. Places for research in teams were to develop only in the 19th century. Until then, pure scientific research and scholarship required considerable investments of time and money. The 18th century Enlightenment saw writing as the engine of civilization and considered the printed word to be intrinsically better than the handwritten word. It was print culture, so it was thought, that allowed the development of public opinion, a tribunal that was independent of all powers and that would be respected by all powers. It is certain that, building on the developing culture of literacy and the infrastructure of reading, early modern Europe experienced a boom of applied technologies that benefited trade and communication networks. That was made possible, even if only in part, by the printing press. Early modern technological change is often associated with notions of revolution, but radical new innovations tended to appear sporadically. The steam engine and the printing press are the most often mentioned exceptions. Indeed, rather than being driven by heroic figures and major inventions, technological change developed gradually through the expansion and improvement of networks, the growing intensity of expert exchange, and the circulation of knowledge, and assisted by improvements in transport infrastructures. Instead of radical transformation, technological change often followed a path of gradual improvements based on trial and error and learning by doing. Efforts of merchants, shipbuilders and sailors active in the Dutch trade in the Baltic during the 16th century led to the development of the float, a sailing vessel superior to those used by their European competitors. Designed to facilitate trans-oceanic trade with a focus on maximum cargo capacity, minimal crew, and low building costs, the float marked a significant improvement on Mediterranean vessels, such as carracks and galleons, the original vehicles of European expansion. Later on, British shipwrights adopted and improved the original design, in turn enabling the expansion of the British Atlantic trade. Sometimes the state played a central role in infrastructural development and technological change. An early example would be the systemic development and standardization of postal services, which started at the beginning of the 16th century. With traffic levels gradually increasing, in the 18th century European states started to develop an interest in improving roads and waterways. The development of transport infrastructure significantly contributed to the intensification of communication both within Europe and between Europe and the wider world. Who used the new technologies and scientific advances that appeared in early modern Europe? The boundaries between those who advanced science and technological change and those who used these achievements were fluid. Science and technology developed in and through networks, interpersonal between scholars and craftsmen, but also material networks such as the postal system. A significant example of the innovator user was migrating craftsmen. Migration was regarded as a prerequisite for a craftsman to become a master. Ambitious architects and engineers were expected to travel to Italian towns early on in their career to continue their education there. By acquiring practical skills and knowledge and transferring it to other places, craftsmen contributed to the production and transformation of science and technology. The printing press also contributed significantly to the development of a joint horizon of expectations in terms of science and technological change. These processes had a specifically European dimension. Exchanges through transnational accelerated through the interaction between different regions of Europe, from the urban centers of Italy to the rural peripheries of northeastern Europe. Traveling craftsmen, with their spatial and intellectual mobility, fostered a transnational culture of experts in the early modern period, but these developments also had exclusionary effects. Above all, they resulted in demarcations, as can be seen in the emerging law on patents, for example, which was intended to protect inventions from unauthorized imitations. Economic development in the early modern period was characterized by the proliferation and coexistence of artisans' workshops in cities and market towns, and by the division of labor among small enterprises operating within a framework of home industries. There were relatively few large-scale factories at this point. Urbanized settlements made it possible for entrepreneur merchants to supervise the activities of nearby rural home producers by distributing raw materials and tools to them and setting standards for the deliveries of semi-manufactured products. The final phase of the production process was carried out in the cities and towns, where the workshops of major guilds and manufactories were operating. Indeed, the rise of the modern industrial age could not do without the division of labor, large-scale specialization, technological innovation, and continuous capital investment. This first manifested in England from the 1730s onwards, with the advent of the Industrial Revolution. The term revolution, however, may be somewhat misleading, as the development was far from radical and swift. The most striking feature of 18th century technical innovations in England had not been worked out by scientists, but rather by experimenting thinkers, self-taught mechanics, engineers, and entrepreneurs. The early decade of the 18th century saw two fundamental innovations: introduction of coke heating in the process of melting iron, invented in Coal-Brookdale in 1709 by an ironmonger, and the development of the steam engine, invented in 1712 by tinker and ironmonger in Staffordshire. These innovations originated with technicians rather than scientists, and shaped the further course of industrialization. The early modern period also saw the intensification of communication within Europe and the sophistication of trade networks and colonial expansion by European powers worldwide. In the colonies, crucial inventions were developed as well, such as the cotton gin developed by the American inventor Eli Whitney in 1793. The exploitation of colonized people and the extraction of resources in many cases was the prerequisite for industrialization in Europe. The turn of the 19th century saw, in addition to political upheaval and new ordering of the empires and nations of Europe, other events understood as evolutionary. Chemistry, for example, underwent dramatic changes. The introduction of modern elements, animal electricity, chemical formula, the periodic system, and so on. These discoveries help to illustrate in retrospect a notion of scientific progress that became the pride of the emerging professions of academic researchers and teachers. Indeed, chemistry illustrates the technological and economic potential of science for the 19th century state. Entire industries were built around the knowledge of carbon compounds that were isolated from industrial mining products such as coal tar, and these industries would later change the material world through innovations in hygiene, pharmaceuticals, nutrition, or textiles. However, recent historiography of science has taken a skeptical stance on such a notion of progress and its focus on individuals. The European empires each pursued research on diseases such as cholera or tuberculosis, spreading due to the pauperization of industrializing states. Louis Pasteur, Robert Koch, and Joseph Lister were celebrated as heroes of the triumphalist narrative of scientific war on microorganisms. This has sometimes obscured competing explanations, which gave the social factors of suffering and epidemics more weight than biology. State-sanctioned hygiene policies remain an enduring heritage of the late 19th century. Equally persistent, though, is the critique of their ideals of health and purity, not least regarding the colonial context or eugenics. The extent to which the science were a source of material wealth, as well as a secularizing force, can be demonstrated by the most important development in the 19th century biology, the theory of biological species formation through variation and selection, evolution, as formulated by the Victorian scientist Charles Darwin. Evolution promoted a secular account of the descent of humankind, becoming thereby both a cornerstone of a modern scientific worldview as well as an object of contestation by religion. The theory also reveals science's connections to the exploration of the world by European powers. Darwin's voyage on the ship HMS Beagle bore testimony to this, as do the vast collections in the natural history museums of European capitals to this day. The provenance of these collections and discoveries in regimes of colonial domination stands in stark contrast to their insight into the diversity of life and its ecological dimensions, thus revealing a downside of scientific progress. The global expansion of European empires had repercussions on the perception of space and time, paving the way towards the conceptual innovations that culminated in the theory of relativity in the 1910s. Time zones, or the standardization of units in the metric system, would cast an ever-growing web of measurement across the planet and the universe, supported by ideas of universal languages and repositories which could catalogue the masses of new knowledge. But the prestige of science's pursuit of an ideal of mechanical objectivity did not remain uncontested. Even a founding figure of the social sciences, such as Max Weber, would soberly concede in 1917 that the sciences could only yield descriptive causal analysis, but could not ever tell a human being what they ought to do in a normative sense. Technology as a field of human activity and politics hardly existed prior to the arrival of industrialization. Only since the mid-18th century had the concept of technology entered public and academic discourse, being, as it were, a significant component of the transition from the pre-modern social order to a new industrial one. The emphasis on technology as a driving force of progress and modernity, and a vital precondition for prosperity, marked a shift from protecting stability towards nurturing perpetual technological change. New practices of technology politics emerged. States started to intervene heavily in the development and adoption of new technologies in their territories, establishing engineering schools, universities, and research institutions. See, for instance, the French École Polytechnique, the Prague Polytechnical Institute, or the Delft University of Technology, all established the turn of the 19th century. Besides a source of income, Europeans started to see technology as defining characteristics of their civilization and essential proof of its superiority. During the 19th century, not only in encounters with non-European cultures, but also within Europe, annual national industrial fairs and exhibitions became a common sight, providing an opportunity to demonstrate technological prowess of the nation. The Great Exhibition of the Works of Industry of all nations, organized in London in 1851, shifted the competition to an international level. Despite such efforts towards nation building, however, technology contributed significantly to the gradual formation of Europe as a cultural and economic unit. The international standardization of national communication and transport networks enabled a growing intensity of contact between European regions and peoples. After the Berne Convention of 1886, a unique European railway regulatory regime was developed, combining various national, commercial, and non-governmental bodies and institutions. Europeans in the long 19th century, particularly those living in urban areas, experienced an unprecedented technological transformation of their work and everyday lives. Europe was a hub both of high-profile scientific institutions and of industrial production. Railways and steamships became the fetishes of the century, symbols of the progress of civilization. They fostered commerce and facilitated the spread of novel ideas. At the same time, the continent was also the site of several colonial metropolises, from which projects of colonial conquest and rule were designed and launched, turning new technologies, such as railways and innovative firing arms, into instruments of European domination in Asia and Africa. They were tools of imperialism that helped governments to get a tighter grip on their territories, in Europe and beyond. The infamous term gunboat diplomacy, linked to European and US imperialism, points to the less benign aspects of 19th century technologies. Weapons and the war material successfully conquered the world, not only in the hands of colonizers, but also rulers and rebels who brought, adopted, produced, or used them. Nonetheless, it would not be accurate to understand Europe purely as a center from which science and technology radiated to the rest of the world. Many of the greatest works of 19th century engineering were built outside of Europe, such as the Suez and Panama Canals. European and North American experts and investors played an essential role in their construction, but so did local and migrant workers, along with local rulers and bureaucrats. This constant intermingling of efforts was essential to making technology and technology-related professions truly global, irreducible to any specific race, nationality, ethno-religious identity, social class, or gender. The science, as a stronghold of rationality, became disputed in the 20th century by means of their involvement with aggression towards humankind and nature. While chlorine gas was originally intended for use in the trenches of Belgium and France in 1915 to remedy shortages of ammunition, specific chemical weapons were subsequently developed and have since been used repeatedly. The Second World War reinforced this picture. The development of airplanes and rocketry should be mentioned alongside Socrative projects to develop an atomic bomb, which used the skills and hard work of a great number of physicists, chemists, and engineers. The active enrollment of science in discrimination, war, and genocide provoked widespread disillusionment and doubt over its civilizing role. This downfall of the sciences from the pinnacle of optimism they had reached in the long 19th century, however, should not obscure the fact that the sciences have also remained an agent of cooperation, pacifism, and increasing human welfare, not least through international organizations such as the World Health Organization in Paris or UNESCO. Cold War witnessed similar tensions. On one hand, it led to an ideological polarization of the sciences, as exemplified by the Soviet agronomist Trofim Lysenko and his theory of Lysenkoism, which was at odds with Mendelian genetics but matched well with the premises of Marxism-Leninism and was considered as pseudoscience in Western Europe and America. Ideological fault lines divided researchers and accelerated superpower competition, such as the development of aeronautics and race to the space. Yet, the sciences also developed tendencies to overcome division, first through international organizations such as the European Council for Nuclear Research, CERN. Second, researchers began to actively reflect on their involvement in the military-industrial complex. They shifted from nuclear research to ecology or became politically active on both sides of the Iron Curtain for issues like disarmament or environment protection. 20th century opened space for the knowledge and ideologies of science and technology to be broadly applied in the management of human affairs. building on the argument that technology and innovation bring progress and prosperity. Governments across Europe started to implement designs to run the state and social affairs as a problem of engineering rather than politics. The technification of administering social affairs, emphasizing ideas of rationalization, standardization, and the depoliticization, resulted in a large-scale proliferation of scientific planning. In response to the Great Depression of the 1930s, technocratic forms of governance grew in relevance and popularity, peaking in 1950s and 60s. Particularly under the authoritarian regimes of Eastern Europe during the Cold War, state authorities and their expert bureaucracies acquired substantial administrative powers. That said, Soviet attempts at planned industrialization and the transformation of nature differed only in scale rather than in quality from Western European proposals for rational housing and urbanism. Military technologies and military systems building were the crucial driving force behind technological innovation in the modern era. In the pre-modern period, military technologies reflected change rather than fueling it. Consider the relative stability of Navy ship design from the 15th to 18th century. But by the 20th century, the combined effect of industrialization and the state's growing role in society, including its management of technological innovations, had ushered in the state-sponsored development of technological change. This also blurred the threshold between peace and war, as nation-states tended to employ war as a political tool. Particularly since the Second World War, national military-industrial complexes have been driving technological change. Computing and the Internet, predominantly developed by US actors, ARPANET and later imported to Europe, clearly document such a tendency. But technologies were not only an instrument of conflict, but also an object of cooperation. Nuclear technology provides an illustrative example here. Despite the existence of the Iron Curtain, the second half of the 20th century witnessed a slow and contested process of technological integration across the divided continent. We have already mentioned CERN. Besides that, the standardization of television and radio broadcasting, the development of e-routes, and so on, represent illustrative examples of pan-European cooperation. Nonetheless, the overwhelming march of modernity aroused the suspicion of those who feared, perhaps naturally, the potential of technology to subvert divine, human, or natural orders previously defined. Envisioning an ultimate clash between man and machine, critics of technology often claimed to defend the cause of humanity against the dehumanizing mechanization. Europeans started to observe the visibly harmful effects of technological progress with growing uneasiness. Cataclysmic events, such as the 1963 collapse of the Vion 10 in northern Italy, or the Chernobyl disaster of 1986, quickly became symbols of the destructive potential of technology. Once apostles of techno-optimism and technological progress, Europeans turned techno-cautious. The logic of the national economy dominated technological production for most of the century. Nationalist leaders promoted policies of industrialization with an aim to reduce the political and economic dangers of dependence on particular providers. Nationalizing existing infrastructures and constructing dams and power plants were measures implemented by all sorts of regimes, left and right, authoritarian and democratic. Moreover, this was also part of an effort to join the group of the so-called developed countries. During the Cold War, the countries of the so-called Third World skillfully exploited the rivalries between and within the two blocs in order to secure advantageous conditions. Since the 1970s, the state often retreated from less profitable industries. Moreover, in the second half of the century, several non-European countries proved that they are not merely imitators of a Western technology, but instead that they have contributed on more than equal terms to shape technological development. The closing decades of the century then witnessed full-scale globalization and delocalization. The actual production of goods moved to countries that could provide large firms with human capital and reasonable infrastructures, without ambitions to impose environmental and labor regulations. The issue of how scientific research and technology are shaped by power, identity and geopolitics has been brought back into the spotlight recently during the COVID-19 pandemic, not only regarding vaccines, but also concerning simple technologies such as face masks. Thank you for your attention, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation.